Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you guys are new. Today's video is going to be my take on the eyeshadow palette tag 5000. This was created by Chic Geek here on YouTube. I will have her channel and her video linked down below where she started this tag. I'm also going to link below Emily's Makeup Bag and Sarah Rose. I saw both of them do this video as well, and so I jumped on the trend and I'm going to film this myself. I also recreated the look that Emily was wearing in her eyeshadow palette tag video because I really loved the orange eyeshadow that she was wearing, and I feel like this video is a little reminiscent of hers because I'm filming for my vanity, which I don't usually do, but I had to kind of get creative with my filming setup so that I could film today because I'm kind of fighting a headache or a migraine, so I'm trying to limit the amount of light in my face. So I'm really hoping that this video turns out okay, but I think it should be all right since it's just a talk through video, but let's go ahead and jump into it. But be sure to check everyone else's videos linked down below as well. So the first question is a palette you wore on a special occasion. I feel like on special occasions, I reach for a bunch of different palettes and I always mix them together, but one that I know I always reach for on a special occasion is this one. This is the Natasha Denona Glam palette. I know for sure that I used this one in conjunction with some other palettes for my makeup on my brother's wedding day. So I would say that that was a pretty special occasion for me too, just to see him get married, and I love my new sister-in-law. But I did use this palette, and I feel like I just always use this one for special occasions too. It's just such a classic palette, and if I don't want a cool tone look, I will pair this with a more warm tone neutral palette and just use maybe the shimmers out of this one. But I feel like I always dip into this one on a special occasion. It's just such a staple in my collection, and it's just a really reliable palette. So definitely this one just made sense for this question. Next up is a palette that you love but is repetitive, and I actually had a hard time picking which palette to go with because I'm very picky on the palettes that I bring in my collection. I really do try to pay attention to what I'm bringing into my collection, and I really look at a color story to see if I think I might use the entire palette. But for this one, I decided to go with the BH Cosmetics Hanging in Hawaii palette. This is really good. I really enjoy this palette, but if you look at the color story, it actually is pretty repetitive. So I would say that these two matte brown shades are pretty similar on the eye, and so are these two. These warmer tones all kind of look pretty similar on the eyes. And then these two deeper shades are different enough, but they're not super different. And then actually the shimmer shades here are all pretty similar too. I love the shimmers in this palette though, so I'm okay with them all being similar. But especially these three right here, they have subtle differences, like this one's slightly lighter, this one's slightly pinker, and this one is a little bit more neutral. This one's a little bit deeper, but they're all pretty similar. So I do love this one, but it is repetitive. So I feel like this was the perfect palette for this question as well. The next question is a palette you got your money's worth out of, and this one was a no-brainer for me. This is the Huda Nude Light palette. I have pan in every single shade in this palette. It does only have 9 pans, but I mean, I have a pretty massive pan in all of them, and I definitely would say I've gotten my money's worth out of this. This is a $29 eyeshadow palette, or I think that was the price roughly when I bought it, either $27 or $29. So I would say for sure for that price, I have definitely got my money's worth out of this one. It's such a good palette. I loved that she released 3 different shade variations of this based on your preferences or your skin tone. This one was really unique in my collection when I got it, very special, and it also taught me to look at an entire color story to see if I was going to be able to use it all, hopefully. And I would say this was actually the first palette in my collection where I felt like I could use every single shade in it and that they would work out for me because I do have very fair skin. So a lot of deeper or more vibrant colors aren't usually my favorite on myself. So this one is very special in my collection, and I definitely think I've gotten my money's worth out of it. Question number 4 is a palette that is an amazing deal, and again, this one's a no-brainer for me. This is the Profusion Harvest palette. This is a 20 shade eyeshadow palette for $10, which is just pretty much unheard of, I feel like. This is such a high quality palette for such an affordable price. You can buy this at Walmart. I don't know if it's at Walmart anymore actually, because Profusion is kind of one of those brands that launches a lot, and then when they launch a new one, their older ones are removed from the shelves. But I think you can still buy this from the Profusion website. So if you can, I would pick it up, especially now that we're going back into the fall season. I feel like this is a really great fall palette. I really have enjoyed this one and I'm excited to continue to use it, especially in the fall season. But yeah, this one is such a good palette, not even just for the price, but especially for the price. The next question is a little bit of a weird answer for me, but it is a quad that you wish was a larger palette. I actually only have one true quad in my collection, and I don't wish that it was a larger palette. It's the Charlotte Tilbury Pillow Talk quad, and I'm fine with it being a quad. But I do typically have these single shades in the format of a quad in my collection. So the reason I say that this answer is a little bit odd is because these 4 shadows are from a much larger palette. I think it's a 35 pan eyeshadow palette that I pulled these from, but all 4 of these shades come from the Kathleen Lights and ColourPop So Jaded palette. So I don't have the shade names on the back of these, unfortunately, but I'm pretty sure they were Pearl, Diamond, Rose Quartz, and Smoky Quartz. I think that that's the name of the 4 of them. I might have gotten some of them mixed up, but I think that's what they're called. But if you know what the So Jaded palette looks like, or if you don't, I'll go ahead and put a picture up of it here. This is a very small snippet from that palette. And now that it's years later, I think I might actually appreciate that color story a little bit more. But I did decide to get rid of the rest of that palette because I just don't really like a 35 pan palette in my collection. I feel like it's just a little bit too excessive. I much prefer smaller, more honed in palettes. These are my favorite 4 shadows from that palette, so I had decided to just keep the 4. But I would love to see the 4 of these in a larger palette that doesn't go that route, if that makes sense. I would love it for it to stay a little bit more neutral, a little bit more of just like a pretty smoky sort of a palette with more neutral type tones. So that's what I'm gonna say for this one, even though technically this did come from a larger palette originally, but I would probably have just taken a different direction with these 4 shadows. But you'll see these again in a later question. Okay, the next question is, you love the quality of the eyeshadow but hate the packaging. I picked 2 for this. One, I feel like a broken record with this, but this is the Kathleen Lights and Il Makiage Disco Fox palette. And I'm gonna say this very quickly because I have mentioned this a lot, but first of all, sometimes it is hard for me to open the palette, I've noticed, especially if I've had something on the hands and I've like wiped them off on a makeup wipe or something, and so my hands are a little bit wet, or if I've applied my makeup with my hands or something and they're just not like completely dry. Opening this is such a pain. Other than that, this is what I'm always talking about, is that this basically has like a handle on the left side of the palette, but it really bothers me because if you hold it with the left side, then what if you're left-handed? How do you apply eyeshadow now? Like, it'd be so nice for a right-handed person, but I personally am left-handed, and the creator of this palette, Kathleen Lights, is left-handed, so I would have loved to see the little handle feature on the right side, or I would have loved to see this have been like an option at checkout or something. I don't know how that would work with inventory, but I would really have loved that. That would have just been an extra detail considering this palette was over $70 US. That's very expensive, and especially since the creator of the palette's left-handed, I just felt like that was a little bit overlooked, and I just don't really love that. But I do love the shadows in the palette. I like the packaging, how it looks, how you could customize it with stickers. I know that got a lot of various feedback. I think it was a little bit ridiculous that the stickers were so expensive. I think they should have just come with the palette, but you got to pick one little sticker set, and I just think that that was a little bit cheap. I would have rather they had like one massive pack of stickers, or at least like more than this, and it should have just come with the palette in my opinion, but that's fine, whatever. But yeah, this palette was very expensive. It was like $70 or $80. I'm not gonna talk about that one anymore because it really just gets on my nerves. The other palette for this one is the Myra Chasing Eternity palette, and this one, you guys know, I love the formula of this. I think it's such a great palette, especially for its price. It's about $18, but the packaging is so bulky. In comparison to a more standard palette, this is one from Nomad. This is the Nomad packaging, and this is the Myra one. It's just very bulky and chunky. It's not good for travel. However, if it was thinner, this palette would be great for travel because of the color story, in my opinion, but I would never really take this traveling because of the bulkiness. So it's a little bit unfortunate for me, especially for an everyday type of palette, and I really wish the packaging was different on both of those. The next question was to show your dream palette with singles. So I don't actually have a ton of singles in my collection. I ended up pulling most of these shades from my custom Lethal palette that I created a few months ago. But outside of this, these here are my only other single shadows, and most of them are from the Juvia's Magic Mini palette. So I don't have a ton to choose from. After I finally created this palette, which took me kind of a while, I realized that I could have popped shades out of my Natasha Denona palettes and then put them back, but I had already settled on this, and that would have probably sent me down a rabbit hole of taking way too long to create this palette. I thought originally that I would create a 9 or a 12 pan palette, but I ended up creating a 15 pan palette because when I think about it, the palettes from Huda, I would say, let me show you one. But the palettes from Huda Beauty, I really love the size of this. And this, of course, has a few more, has 18 shades, but I felt like having 15 shades would be a little bit more my speed because inevitably in a palette like this, there's usually about 3 shades that I just don't really use a lot. So if I was gonna create my own palette, I think it would actually end up being a palette about this size or a 12 pan palette, but I kind of went in between and went with a 15. So I definitely am limited to the shades I have in my collection here, but I do really like this one. This outer row or column was the one that I added at the last minute. So originally I had thought that I would want these 12. If I had to get rid of 3, it would be this column on the outer edge. But this is a color story very curated to my preferences. So I actually tried to add some that would give me some variety. So like I said, most of my colors are from Lethal Cosmetics. So let me tell you what the shades are here. I kind of tucked them in a little bit tightly. And I think I'll go ahead and swatch them for you too so that you can see. But let me go ahead and give you kind of an overview because I'm gonna have to take the shadows out to tell you the colors. But I've got lots here from Lethal, and then this middle shade here that's like a medium, kind of like a light medium matte shade, and this one up here are from the Natasha Denona Ayana palette. I kept the 2 of those shades because they were my favorite, and then I decluttered the rest. The packaging had broken, so I decided to take the shadows out. And then these 2 up here are from that quad I showed you guys from ColourPop So Jaded, and then actually these 2 shades I felt like really matched with these 2 Lethal ones. And I really like this top Lethal shade better than the pearl shade here, but they're super similar. It's my perfect inner corner eyeshadow color basically. And then this matte shade here is super similar to this one from Lethal, so I decided to take that out. But if I were to make this quad into a larger palette, this is kind of what I would want it to look like. So those are both from that quad. This one is from the Profusion, oh, I just blanked on the name, Ethereal palette. And then this is the shade Perry from Give Me Glow Cosmetics. It's one of their singles. And then these 2 over here are also from Lethal. This one's from the Juvia's Place Magic Mini palette. But I do want to go ahead and make sure to tell you guys what the Lethal shades are called because you can purchase them as singles. So this first one here is called Nymph, and this would be kind of like my perfect inner corner highlight shade. It is very, very pretty, and I typically would use this type of a shade on the inner corner. I wouldn't really use it much anywhere else, but here is that swatched. Now, I've mentioned before, but I want to mention it here because I am going to talk positively about these Lethal custom shadows. I created a custom palette from Lethal, and I was a little bit let down by it, but I want to explain a little bit because it was very expensive, and that I think is the most expensive palette in my collection. And I really like the idea of it because you're actually creating your own palette. Like, it looks like a palette versus just putting singles in an empty palette kind of like this. But some of these shades didn't exactly look like I thought they were going to in person. I think if I could, I'm kind of debating picking up 2 singles from Lethal, and it might be something that I wait and see if I can find on sale. But what I noticed when I was looking, I waited like a month and a half to press order, you know, and it was because so many shades were going in and out of stock. So it was really hard to actually create the palette with every shade that I wanted. But I did think that this shade here was going to be more of like a gold shade versus a baby yellow, which is what I would consider in person. So I say that to say that watch my video on this palette before you purchase any of the singles I'm mentioning today. However, I do think that the formula takes some getting used to. So if you can find accurate color swatches and color representations, or if you're better at judging the color online, because I clearly wasn't, I could not accurately see some of the colors, in my opinion, on the website, and I had trouble finding a couple of them online. So if you're better at that than me, that's step one. Otherwise, just kind of take it with a grain of salt and make sure to do your research first. But this formula also, I would say, has a bit of a learning curve, and now that I'm more familiar with it, I do like it more. So I am thinking about doing like a follow-up video review on my Custom Lethal palette to give you some updated thoughts more in depth, but I wanted to mention that very briefly here. So sorry to take a little bit too much time on that, but this next shade here is called Moonbeam. This is my perfect, like, set the concealer, set the eyeshadow primer shade down. A lot of people don't like this type of a shade in a palette, but for me, it is pretty necessary and I use it every single day. So if I have a palette and I've only got one pan in it, you can pretty much bet that it's in a shade that looks pretty similar to this one, and it's a must-have for me in all my palettes. Next up, this is the shade, I think it's called Smoky Quartz from the So Jaded palette. I actually just hit pan in this today when I was creating my swatch of my perfect single palette, or palette with singles. So here's that shade. This is such a pretty shade for every day. This is the shade called Diamond from So Jaded, I believe. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's what this one's called. This is a Super Shock shadow. So I love this one because you could put this over any shimmer and just give it a totally different look. And it's just really pretty. It's kind of more subtle on a swatch, but I really do enjoy that one. And then next up, this is a shade from the Iyanna palette. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of this one, but if you look at the little Iyanna palette, there's only 5 shades, so it shouldn't be too hard to tell. This one's actually pretty similar to that Smoky Quartz shade. So like I said, if I had to get rid of 3, that would be one of them. But here it is here. And it's different enough on the lid. So while they're similar, this one is definitely more warm. And then this one's more of like a taupey with a little bit of silver almost. I'm gonna kind of do that swatch a little bit better. Swatches are not easy when you're not seeing what you're doing. I think that they're different enough though. So those are kind of my more neutral. That's definitely the most neutral row in the palette. Moving on to the second row. This shade is called Archetype from Lethal as well. And this is just a nice sort of pinky tone transition shade. I'm just gonna swatch them where I can actually see them and then show you guys. But this would be a really nice sort of a transition shade in my opinion. I also noticed while I was creating my little singles palette that a lot of it is actually kind of similar to this one from Viseart. So I wanted to point that out because I really like this palette. So they're all pretty, some of them are pretty similar to that one. Next up, this is a shade from the Juvia's Place Magic Mini palette. Again, I don't know the name of this one, but it is a nice kind of gold shade. Every now and then I like a gold on the lid, so I wanted to make sure to include that in the palette. Next up is the other shade from the Iyanna palette. This one is very underrated, I feel like. It is such a nice crease and transition shade, and I just feel like it looks so pretty on the eyes, and it really, I don't know, it just makes a look very, very pretty on the lid. So I really, really love that one, even though it just looks like a pretty subtle brown shade. I really like it. Okay, next up, this is one of the prettiest shimmer shades, and I think this one would just be kind of fun to have in a palette. This is from the Profusion Ethereal palette. Oh, it's called Fluorescence, I think. I was gonna say I was blanking on the name, but I think it's called Fluorescence. This is such a pretty shade. I mean, this is a very, very high quality shade for the price especially. It does swatch a little bit more sheer, but on top of a glitter glue, or if you get the shade wet, it is very stunning on the lid. Next up, again from Lethal, this is the shade Lithium. This is one that I thought when I was ordering it that it was going to be a lot lighter than it is. You can see it's actually a pretty deep shimmer shade, but again, it's on that third column. This would be one of the first ones to go, but sometimes I do like a deeper shimmer on the outer edge when I hold my arm up, it is like not showing it very well. Okay, but it's a darker shimmer shade, and it is, again, just very, very pretty. This was not the best way to show the swatches because as I'm holding my arm up, my arm is like twisting. I think I'm gonna go and swatch the bottom row on my other arm so you guys can see it a little bit better. Okay, next up, these are some of the prettiest shades from Lethal. They did take me some getting used to, but I really like them now. So this first one's called Evoke. This has got to be, I think, my favorite out of the three I'm about to show you because the swatch is just so pretty, but it is really pretty on the lid too. It is a little bit chalky at first, like when you first pick it up. Let me try and show you guys actually what I'm talking about. So I'm hoping you can see the difference here. See here, it's kind of like chalky almost. And I'm gonna pick it up on my second finger and then kind of blend it. And now look how reflective it is. So if you use a lighter hand and kind of blend it out is when it gets really pretty. So you kind of have to build it up. And that's what I was talking about with the formula being a little bit different. You gotta really get used to it, in my opinion. Next up is the shade called Kindred, again from Lethal. And this one is really, really nice too. It's a nice peachy shifting shade. So it's like a pink peach. And I actually do have this on the lid today. What's funny about this look is that Emily used a ColourPop quad to create her look, and I had to dip into 5 of my palettes to recreate it, but I really like how it turned out. Next up is the shade called Incarnate. Again, another Lethal one. This one's really pretty. It's a nice like purple shade. It's almost reminiscent of the one in that Viseart Cashmere palette I pointed out, but it's a little bit different. I really like that one too. I like the one in Viseart better than that shade, but it's not in my singles collection. Next up, here's the shade called Perry from Give Me Glow. I really love this shade, and my dog's name is Perry, so it's extra special. But yeah, this one's really pretty. Okay, and then lastly, I picked a nice deeper brown shade called Kindlewood from Lethal, and this would be kind of a nice deepening up shade or a nice eyeshadow liner look. So here is that shade. So poorly swatched. I really like how all of these look together, and I feel like this would be my kind of perfect palette with my single shades. And I like how it has a lot of neutrals, but then these kind of more colorful or more fun shimmer shades can really be paired with the more neutral light brown type shades. I know that was a very long answer to show you guys this palette, but I actually had a lot of fun creating it, so I thought I would just go ahead and dig a little bit deeper into showing you guys the palette and some swatches. But let's move on to the next question, which is palettes you like to combine together. Lately, this combination has been my go-to. So I'm gonna start out with this one specifically because this Milani Gilded Mini palette in Whiskey Business has been my go-to every single day to mix in with all of my palettes. So I love a good colorful palette, a good colorful shimmer especially, but I tend to not put super bright or colorful shades in the crease or above, like a transition shade, contrary to what my eyeshadow is today, because this is pretty unusual for my type of eyeshadow. But what I really prefer is to use shades like this, especially the first 4 in here, and really like the lightest 3, to put in the crease, all up to the brow bone. Then I want to dip into a really pretty shimmer shade to really dress up the lid and the look all together while still having a pretty subtle and wearable look overall. So I've been really dipping into this palette a lot from Huda. This is the Rose Quartz palette. My favorite 2 shades to dip into lately with that Milani palette have been Energized and Quartz, especially this one called Energized. It is so pretty, but I'll show you the 2 of them. Quartz is a little bit more subtle, but I really love the shade Energized. They've just been a lot of fun during the week to have a little bit of a fun look without dipping into some of these brighter pink matte shades or the more blue toned shimmers even to create that look. So lately, this has been a really good go-to for me to create a fun eyeshadow look in combination with one another. The next to last question is a larger palette that you wish was smaller. I think this is the same answer that Sarah Rose gave in hers. No, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was Emily. I don't know. I feel like I watched someone who gave this as an answer. I don't know. But I had to also go with this one. This is the Give Me Glow Cosmetics Pastel Dreams palette. You guys know this is one of my favorite palettes. I'm still trying to hit pan in Lavender Sky. So if you're keeping up with my little mini eyeshadow project pan, I have not hit pan in it yet, but I'm very close. I've been using it all the time. But this palette is massive for no reason. This is a beautiful pastel palette with 12 really pretty pastel shades, but I feel like who is ever going to use up these eyeshadows? I would love to meet them. I have been trying to hit pan in this Lavender Sky shimmery purple shade for so long and still haven't been able to. So that just shows me how long these are going to last. I feel like they could have made this palette so much smaller. Let's find another 12 pan palette that it could have been. Like here's one from Persona. This is the Persona Identity palette, but look how much smaller this palette could be. And yet I still have only hit pan in 2 of these shades. These are of course also really wearable colors, so they're easier to hit pan in, at least for me. And I just feel like it would still be really hard to hit pan on any of those shades, even if they were smaller. So I really do wish that this one was smaller, but I do love this palette. So, you know, I'll live with it being a little bit excessively large in my collection. The last question is an eyeshadow palette you wish you had a matching face palette. And for this one, I'm gonna bring up the palette I mentioned earlier. This is the Viseart Cashmere palette. I really love this one for every day. And for me, a face palette is a good go-to travel type palette when you're traveling or you just want something really quick and easy for an everyday look. That's what I think about this palette. So I would love to have a companion face palette to go with this. I think that I would get a lot of use out of it. And I feel like Viseart would do a really good job with cheek products. I've never tried anything other than this palette from Viseart, but that would be something that I think I would really enjoy to see from the brand, and especially to go along with this eyeshadow palette. Okay, that's all the questions for this eyeshadow palette tag. I know it took a long time on the singles one, but I really had a good time doing that. So hope you guys don't mind that too much, but I really hope that you guys enjoyed today's video. Be sure to check out the creator's video, Chic Geek. I'll have her video linked down below, like I mentioned, and then I'm also gonna have 2 others for you to watch. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Also consider subscribing to my channel if you want to see more content from me, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.